It is almost impossible to name a popular superhero that hasn't undergone a reboot, refresh, or even full-on reimagining. And Spider-Man in some ways is probably the poster child for this need to reinvent more than any other mainstream character. In the last 20 years, we had the Sam Raimi trilogy, 2 Mark Webb films, the recent John Watts movie starring Tom Holland, and it would be a crime not to mention the incredible Spider-Verse films. Even the flagship Amazing Spider-Man comic book that has been running since 1963 has gone through its fair share of rebranding. Whether we are talking about the current run known as Volume 6 that started just last year, or the more esoteric stuff like the truly confusing back-to-basics approach that was the One More Day / Brand New Day run of the series. An arc where a literal demon gave Spider-Man an ultimatum in which he was forced to choose between saving Aunt May or giving up his marriage to Mary Jane. Yes, Mephisto, an all-powerful being from the depths of hell, instead of cursing the planet to despair, plague, and famine, decided that with their infinite power, the most concentrated evil they could enact would be to get Spider-Man to play into a Faustian bargain where he had to get out of his most important relationship. It was incredibly stupid, almost to the point of hilarity, but the main reason it was done was simple. A married Spider-Man, a Spider-Man that had to juggle fighting crime, saving the world, and the trials and tribulations of being in a successful relationship had painted the writers into a corner where Peter Parker was suddenly not as relatable to a younger audience. And at its core, this is the main reason behind the constant refreshes within the superhero genre. An origin story where a usually underdog protagonist is thrust into a power fantasy where they suddenly have to come to grips with the responsibility of their newfound abilities and fight off new supervillains, all the while trying to protect their secret identity, that is the formula for a story as old as time, and it is instantly relatable. Everyone knows what it's like to feel like an underdog, and these fledgling superheroes, it is easy to connect with them. But a series with hundreds of issues of mythology, sidekicks, retcons, a full-on rogues gallery of villains, marriages and mortgages, something about the pure escapism is lost as soon as continuity and real-world issues start to become more and more important fixtures within the narrative. And when your fan base is a mix of kids that are too young to care about whether or not Spider-Man is a good husband, and an older fan base of nerds who may or may not be afraid of women altogether, this version of Spider-Man had lost some of his magic when it came to his audience. But how do you tell an interesting story about an established superhero? How do you keep things interesting when Bruce Wayne has more money than God, a fleet of bat-themed vehicles and weaponry, a series of expendable orphan children to exploit as sidekicks, and answers to any situation, even including this one? And the answer is more simple than you'd think. It is at this point where the narrative needs to get away from just the daily struggles of being a demigod, even though those can certainly ground the story when they're done well, and instead the story needs to become more about the struggles of your franchise's antagonists. Think about it. The Dark Knight is only interesting because of Heath Ledger's portrayal of the Joker. The Batman animated series won a Daytime Emmy for Outstanding Writing for the episode Heart of Ice, which focused on Mr. Freeze's tragic backstory. And even in Insomniac's previous Spider-Man games, characters like Doc Ock and the Tinkerer are far more developed over the course of each of these games' narratives than the titular webheads. And so with the recent release of Marvel's Spider-Man 2 by Insomniac, we find ourselves in an interesting place from a writing standpoint. And it is also here that I'm going to issue a spoiler warning, not just for Spider-Man 2, but also for 2018's first game in the series and for the Miles Morales title. In Spider-Man 1, Peter Parker is around a decade into his tenure as Spider-Man. Even before the events of the first game in this now trilogy, Peter is already intimately familiar with his role as the hero of New York, and has already gone toe-to-toe with many of his stable of villains off-screen in the events that have led up to this story now being told. As Spider-Man, he is a fixture in this city. J. Jonah Jameson has already launched his campaign against the Wallcrawler. Several antagonists such as Electro and Scorpion have already been secured in the high-security man-made island known as the Raft, which seems to be the marveled-up version of Rikers Island for supervillains. And he's already established connections with characters like Black Cat and Yuri Watanabe. As Peter, he's already moved on from being a full-time photographer and made his way into working for Dr. Otto Octavius. He's already had some issues with Mary Jane that starts this trilogy off with them not being a couple, and he helps Aunt May by volunteering at the same homeless shelter that she's been working at. By the end of that game, Dr. Octavius breaks bad with his new Doc Ock persona, causing for Peter to lose a friend, a mentor, but also his employer. Aunt May dies at the hands of a bioweapon that was released by Mr. Negative and Peter's old boss, and Peter's best friend has gone missing with a strange illness. With the only two positive notes for Peter in this game coming from Mary Jane and Peter rekindling their relationship and the introduction of a new Spider-Man in town. And real quick, it should also be stated that while the original PS4 edition of this game featured a Peter Parker that looked like this, subsequent games, including the PS5 remaster of the same game, featured a new face for this protagonist, and I'm just not sure I'm here for it, even if it has been a few years since this change was made. But with this established Peter, it is really the story around him that makes that game interesting. Doc Ock's story is tragic, Mr. Negative is a multifaceted enemy that keeps things interesting at the very least, and the death of Aunt May is a gut punch that will catch most players off guard the first time they play this game. Peter Parker is only interesting in how he responds to these things, as his station in this story is solidified by his already developed role of Spider-Man. But it is really with Miles that we get the refresh treatment. Miles Morales, in this original outing, we are given his origin story, which features the death of his father Jefferson Davis at the hands of Mr. Negative, a spider bite, and ultimately a team-up with Peter. In the follow-up, 2020's Miles Morales, the fledgling superhero is essentially tasked with protecting New York by himself for the first time after Peter makes it clear that he's going to be going away overseas with Mary Jane on a journalistic excursion. And with the senior Spider-Man gone, Miles is the only line of defense in a plot that includes corporate takeovers and mismanagement that have left Harlem as a test ground for an unstable energy alternative known as Nuform. But as conspiracy and rival factions begin to take center stage, Miles is forced into conflict with people that were once incredibly important to him. Uncle Aaron, who is now moonlighting as the Prowler, and the leader of the underground known as the Tinkerer, who turns out to be one of Miles's oldest friends, a young woman named Finn. Finn's older brother got sick and eventually died while helping develop Nuform for the Roxxon Corporation, and Finn has since sought vengeance on the company, but has been using extra-legal methods of taking down the company. And that puts the new Spider-Man directly in conflict with her. And even though this story is much smaller in scope when compared to the revolving door of enemies present in the first game, and the threat is much smaller in scope as it is localized to a single district of the city, the writing present in this game punches way harder than it did in the first game, at least by my estimation. And I think it's because Miles Morales keeps its world smaller and more character-driven. This is a story about a kid being forced into a larger-than-life scenario, but the stakes are personal, heartbreaking, and in a lot of ways relatable given the lack of history that is placed on Miles' shoulders. In Miles Morales, the player is treated to the best of both worlds in terms of superhero writing. We get the origin story, we get to follow our new protagonist during the most harrowing events of his first year on the job, but we are also introduced to antagonists that feel decidedly less cartoonishly evil. Sure, Doc Ock and Mr. Negative were grounded by the writers, deciding to showcase the duality of both of these characters as they made their descent into supervillainy during the events of the first game. But even though both of these characters have tragic backstories, by the end of that game's plot, they have both stepped firmly over that edge into Madman territory. And the supporting rogues gallery, these guys just kind of keep up their villain of the week kind of demeanor. But in the case of Finn, she is not a villain in the traditional sense. She is sympathetic, and her goals are justified to a certain extent. It is just her methodology that puts her at odds with Spider-Man, and it is really more of a failing of the system around her that let Roxxon proceed unchecked. And as things start to crumble around her and she is unable to let go of her mission, it makes her ultimate fate that much more of a gut punch, as her final act is one of sacrifice to the people around her. Aaron's story is definitely not as impactful as Finn's, as his role of the Prowler is a bit more comic booky, essentially acting as a high-profile thief for hire. But in his relationship to Miles, things are definitely far more grounded. And it is really his desire to protect Miles that puts him at odds with the new Spider-Man, and their ensuing fight is really a strong moment for that story. Spider-Man 2 by comparison feels much more like a random arc in a fairly established series than either of the two games that came before it. Both of our protagonists are fairly defined by the beginning of the events of this game, with their main struggle coming from this pair's inability to find equilibrium between being superheroes and keeping up with the mundanity of normal life with things like keeping jobs and getting accepted into college. And this struggle, it is forced to the forefront of their interactions in a pretty ham-fisted way. After the introduction and the spectacle-driven encounter with a kaiju-sized Sandman, Peter loses his job as Miles' new physics teacher. And as he retires back to Aunt May's house that he has clearly been taken care of, Mary Jane shows him a photo album that jogs up a moment of a time where his aunt broke down how important it was for Peter to have balance in his life. If there is a core theme in this story to the civilian lives of Peter and Miles, it is this concept of finding balance. But in practice, these two characters are incredibly bad at finding it. And I would even go as far as to say that neither character really makes an attempt at making their life more harmonious until the very end of this experience. And even then, it is done in a way that is more perplexing than anything. But I will get around to that in a bit. So with these established superheroes trying to find balance in their day-to-day lives, I would say that this is hardly the bit of grounding that would be necessary to really explore either of these characters. There is one bit of solid character development in this game for Miles, but it really comes into play a bit later in the form of his relationship with Martin Lee, or Mr. Negative. But again, I'll circle back around to that one later too. So with these protagonists being largely static when compared to their previous outings, I was certain that the onus of this story would be placed on our main antagonists to really flesh out things like characterization and thematic weight. But again, Spider-Man 2 is in a weird place. For the majority of this campaign, Kraven the Hunter is thrust into the spotlight as the main villain, and he is functionally Bane-like in his implementation.
Oh, you think darkness is your ally?
He is threatening and charismatic, but his motivations are pretty dumb, at least in terms of grounding him as a fully realized villain. He is on a hunt for superheroes and villains because he's a hunter and he seeks bigger game with the hopes of dying gloriously in battle once he finally meets his match. And really, that's kind of all there is to this character. Sure, there is some backstory stuff that can be found in the form of collectibles where we get some insight into his family dynamic, but these breadcrumbs only truly serve to make this character seem more like a force of nature than a motivated antagonist. He does what he does. He kills people. Sometimes to decent effect, like when he mercilessly killed Scorpion after introducing that character as a pretty sizable threat. But when it comes to a character like Vulture, who has been somewhat of a mainstay, at least in some capacity, for both of the previous games, Mr. Adrian Toomes is seemingly killed off screen. Kraven just shows up, and a lot of the characterization that would serve to make him seem more menacing is told to us rather than shown to us. And even in a bit of exposition that could have served to humanize this character further, after it was revealed that this big push to New York was motivated by the Hunter losing his battle with cancer, even this is just a little one-off discovery that is never really addressed in any of Kraven's actions. In cutscenes, he's just a supernaturally strong killing machine, and anything further about the character is pretty much told to us in the form of audio diaries. But of course, similarly to how Mr. Negative dominated the first game's antagonist slot only to be pushed to the side once Doc Ock showed up, Kraven is really only here to make situations dire enough for another plot beat to occur. Very early on, around the same time that the whole balance theme is being kicked up, Harry Osborn makes his first real appearance in the series. He was in the background for the first game, but he had been struggling with an unnamed disease and was essentially used as a method of introducing the idea that symbiotes would eventually find their place in the plot. Norman Osborn, unwilling to lose his son after the death of his wife, has been trying to fix this illness with anything and everything, including the development and accidental release of the Devil's Breath virus from the first game that wiped out a chunk of New York's population, including Aunt May. And in a post-credit scene, we are shown Harry floating around in one of those Star Wars tanks from The Empire Strikes Back as a symbiote is more or less merging with our sick little friend. But now he's here, and he's interested in making up for lost time, and he wants to give Peter a job, so it's all good. But as the story goes forward, the symbiote's power begins to manifest, eventually allowing Harry to more or less emulate Spider-Man's powers after the two friends share their secrets with each other. Harry takes to his new powers with a lot of enthusiasm, especially after being sidelined for so long, but eventually things take a turn when not only does the alien suit that Harry has been merged with starts to take an interest in his friend, but after Peter is mortally wounded, the symbiote merges with Peter so quickly that any drama that could have been found in this scene is immediately pushed to the side. And at this moment, the story becomes a less convincing and considerably less fun parody of the emo Tobey Maguire montage. The black suit does what the black suit does. It corrupts, it twists motivations, it isolates Peter in his thirst for control, but without the foundation of presenting this Peter as a damaged individual at all. I mean, by all accounts, this is the most positive and vanilla portrayal of the character that I've ever seen. His heel turn is just more of a plot device than anything, and it is designed more as a tool to cause a rift in his relationship with Harry, who, actually needs this suit to survive, as Peter does his best drug addict impression under the effects of this new suit. And again, we understand that Harry is hurting, we understand that he feels abandoned, but when this frail little guy is reunited with his suit and the symbiote just happens to take on an appearance that is basically one-to-one to the classic hulking Todd McFarlane design, it felt significantly less like a stylistic choice meant to personify Harry's relationship with the alien parasite, and more like a blatant bit of fan service meant to elicit a fuck yeah kind of response from the more bro-y part of the audience. But given the response to Topher Grace's streamlined design of Venom from the third Sam Raimi movie, I guess I can see why they chose this more classic look. And just as a quick little nitpick, the symbiote-Harry combo just kind of decree the whole "we are Venom" thing.
We are.
But again, this just kind of feels like a plot beat that the writers wanted to hit and just kind of slapped together this scene with very little build-up. And given the bizarre choice of calling Miles' electric powers in this series Venom as well, we are just in this bizarre place where the name just seems to be synonymous with this series for no other reason than it's just always been that way. But now that this giant alien monster is out on the loose, the plot takes a turn towards a classic alien invasion type story, and Kraven is snacked on quite unceremoniously. And then it is just a matter of getting the suit off Harry, doing the boss fight thing, and then hitting your sick friend with a particle accelerator, which leaves him brain damaged but more or less still alive after Miles defibrillates him with his Venom powers. And given this game's last minute revelation that Norman Osborn is going to use yet another unstable serum, this time called the G serum, in hopes of getting Harry back to health, it should be clear that Norman has learned nothing from the whole Devil's Breath thing, which he kind of should be aware killed the aunt of his loser son's best friend. But this G-Serum thing, it also lets us know that the whole Green Goblin arc is going to be a thing for the inevitable Spider-Man 3. But this slapdash approach of making sure that we hit certain milestones in the greater mythology always comes at the cost of telling a unique story, and it robs us of the character drama surrounding a role that should have had the equivalent weight of the Aunt May or Finn moment. And for me, this shit just fell flat. In fact, the majority of the storytelling here kind of felt that way to me, with the only interesting bits coming from places that were both surprising or just kind of stupid. For me personally, the best bits of this game's storytelling came from how a few key characters were explored. First, I love the bit revolving around the reformed villains of Tombstone and Mysterio, with Tombstone essentially working as a go-kart operator in Coney Island now that he had been released from the raft. And given the fact that Tombstone straight up murdered some people in the first game, drug trafficked, and must have been involved in a huge RICO case, it's nice to know that this Insomniac version of the US has a far more effective prison reform system than we have in the real world. Mysterio partnering up with a few software engineers to introduce a bizarre form of augmented reality was also a nice little side story, especially since it subverted expectations by making it so that the corrupted version of the attraction had nothing to do with the one-time villain, and everything to do with some con artists looking to make a quick buck and blame it on Mysterio. And as a quick little side note, Mysterio's design here, it fucking rules. There is also a bit with Yuri Watanabe becoming a vigilante called Wraith and her chasing down a cult leader known as the Flame, but this is just DLC bait for the inevitable Carnage chapter. And then there is this really weird bit where Venom turns Mary Jane into a symbiote called Scream, and while I could tell what they were going for in this section, it kinda rang on deaf ears as far as I was concerned. Mary Jane, under the effects of the alien, essentially blames Peter for being the reason she is working a job that she hates, and having to shoulder the burden of keeping them afloat financially. But given Mary Jane's intro speech about needing to change things from the inside after her recent book on Symkaria only sold a handful of copies, which, damn, you have to have more friends than that. Peter's cries of accepting the fact that he has been a terrible partner, even though he went to Symkaria for her to write that book in the first place, it just seemed a little too Mr. and Mrs. Smith for me. And the following bit with Peter taking his mask off and having a full-on conversation in a recently rocked neighborhood, I don't know, it kind of seemed like he was just going out of his way to give up his secret identity at a few key moments in this game. But the best bits of writing here come from Miles and his relationship with Martin Lee. Martin haunts Miles for the majority of this game. When Craven shows up on the scene and starts to kidnap prisoners aboard a raft transport ship, Miles eventually comes across Mr. Negative, and it is clear that he's about to drown in the river after the ship's hull has been breached. Miles struggles to do anything, paralyzed by his hatred for the man, but before he can act, Lee is kidnapped and taken by Craven's goons. Eventually, Lee is tracked down, but it is in this weird situation where Miles himself has been kidnapped by the hunters, and then Craven does some inexplicable bullshit and pairs Miles up with his nemesis to battle one another in a duel to the death. But once we are here, Mr. Negative dives into Miles' mind, and the two do battle in a way where suddenly the two understand each other on a completely different level. And when the battle is over, instead of giving in to his hatred, Miles kind of yeets Martin Lee out of the battle in order to find Peter. And what follows is a terrific redemption arc on Martin Lee's end. And if there is any character that truly grows over the course of this game, it's him. Miles too, but it is definitely at the behest of Martin Lee. And in a scene of sacrifice on Martin's end, this is really where I found myself connecting to these two characters.
If I can transfer all of my power into the symbiote, I think I can neutralize it and free Peter.
What'll happen to you?
I guess we'll find out.
Well, if this is my last chance to say anything to you, I won't forgive you. It's just not in me. But I can't carry this hate for you anymore, man. So let's set things right. You and me.
But overall, this whole game, it's kind of an uneven experience. There are definitely moments to connect to, but there are definitely moments that had me rolling my eyes, and there were just moments that felt like they were robbed of any impact. And so, back to this balance thing I brought up earlier. It is kind of a motif. We watch these two spider people struggle with balancing their civilian lives with their alter egos pretty much in the same way for the entirety of the game. Miles struggles to even get a dent into his personal statement for his college application, which, my brother in Christ, it says right there, it needs to only be 500 words or less. Compared to the rest of what you've got going on in your life, this is literally nothing. But whenever there's an opportunity for Miles to run off and play superhero, it is clear that is where his priorities are. And with a lot of the early missions in Miles' campaign being things like helping your classmate find a missing school mascot or helping another classmate ask their partner to homecoming, it is kind of hard to take this little plot beat seriously. These are not high stakes, and Miles would rather do any of these things than balance his life. As for Peter, he is kind of in a similar situation, but given the fact that he has this new partner, a partner who is willing to jump into the superhero role at any time, it makes things kind of silly as well. And especially when Peter is off helping bees pollinate or riding an e-bike around the park, it just kind of feels like the sense of urgency that was placed on Peter at the beginning of the game kept getting pushed to the side. Plus, once Peter does find a way of making ends meet by scoring a pretty swanky job, he keeps figuring out ways of bringing the fight back to this new place of employment. That one's kind of more of a joke than anything, but it certainly felt like a cool twist of fate when this kept happening. But the funny thing is, for Peter, balance is eventually found, but it's kind of in the most hand-wavy way possible. With Harry in a coma of sorts and his new place of employment repeatedly blown up, Peter decides that he needs to turn his focus away from being Spider-Man for a while and work on his new biotech startup ran out of his garage, while Mary Jane makes the decision to quit her job and focus on projects similar to the one that she only sold 14 copies of. All of this seems less like an attempt at gaining some sort of balance and more like a full-on act of delusion. These people need to pay their mortgage, they show that in the beginning of the game, and this new approach is not going to help them do that. But the craziest moment comes just seconds later, when Peter starts to explain to Miles that he needs to take a more hands-off approach to the whole Spider-Man business, just for Miles to explain that he's got this and he can handle the entire city. And this is after a full game that just showed that Miles was struggling to find that balance that was so thematically important just moments earlier. And with a post-credit scene more or less introducing us to Cindy Moon, aka Silk from the comic book series, there is this kind of, it's okay, Peter, you can go ahead and retire, let the minorities handle the crime fighting from now on, we've got this covered kind of vibe to everything. And realistically, given how much better written and how much better performed Miles is throughout this plot, how unlikable Peter could be during these events, even if, yeah, he mostly was under the influence of the black suit, how cringe Peter's banter seems to have become, and how it is always Miles that seems to be taking on the more important roles to the plot, I couldn't help but feel that retiring Peter was always kind of the point of this game, as far as Insomniac's writing goes. It's no secret, with the success of the Spider-Verse movies, Miles is fast becoming the more popular of the two Spider-Men. And given the fact that Peter represents a completely different era of the character, it is only natural that he is becoming kind of stale and unrelatable. But by contrast, the writers seem to be having far more to work with when it comes to the new Spider-Man. Peter is kind of the lame millennial Spider-Man in this current iteration, and Miles is the cool up-and-comer with way more potential. And that brings me back to the scene where Peter first gets the black suit. Given this series' penchant for killing important characters like Aunt May and Finn from the previous two games, there was a split second after Peter had been stabbed where I thought, no fucking way. But with Harry in the same room, it was immediately clear where this plot was going. And if it were just me talking, I think killing Peter off would have been the ballsiest move that Insomniac could have pulled. It would have shook the foundation of this series and made this game hit on a level where it would have just felt important. It would have made Peter feel important. But instead, he's just a nerd that's going to be hanging out in his garage for a while now. And I know that I've pretty much spent the entirety of this video up until now just talking about the story. But that's kind of for a good reason. And that is because at its core, this is an incredibly solid game. There are new bells and whistles, new powers to play with, a flight suit that makes maneuvering around the city just a bit cooler, a few new combat options, and updated graphics that are just stunning to look at. But this game is incredibly iterative on what came before it. Not in a bad way, mind you. I mean, I've now played 3 of these games at launch for good reason, and it's because they're just a joy to play. Swinging around New York, even in this most recent outing, feels incredible, and with options that increase the sense of speed and a few quality of life improvements to the mobility, things have arguably never been better. The combat engine is exactly what you're looking for if you're a fan of the other 2 titles. Combos are fun to pull off, finishers are satisfying, the focus system keeps you making quick strategic choices between damage and healing, and gadgets like the new web grabber that yanks nearby enemies and environmental objects into a convenient clump of ragdolled enemies in a shower of particles is always satisfying to use. But if I'm being honest, even the best parts of this game did start to feel a little been there, done that. And some of the changes felt a little superfluous or like missed opportunities altogether. First, gadgets are fairly limited in this game, with some of the best like the web bomb being conspicuously absent. Suit powers from the first game are made a thing of the past, and with Miles' Venom powers from his first game, the developers at Insomniac made an attempt to level the playing field by introducing Peter's Iron Spider arms to his repertoire and later his symbiote abilities. And even with these new changes and Miles' powers changing throughout the adventure, things feel flashy and cool at first, but once you realize that these powers function essentially the same, it makes it so Miles and Peter really only play marginally different. L1 and X will always do a power that launches enemies into the air, L1 and Square will always be a single target move, and so on and so on. In his game, these changes really made Miles feel different enough in the second game to make him more exciting to play. But with a sequel constantly changing the playable character around, it does feel like a missed opportunity when games like Devil May Cry 5 have shown exactly how cool diverse toolkits can be between different playable cast members. And really the same type of criticism kind of goes to the majority of this game if I'm being honest. Crimes in this title feel considerably less fleshed out when compared to previous entries, with these random events recycling much earlier than I remembered them previously doing. And with these 2 playable characters sharing the same pool of random events, I found myself experiencing the bad type of deja vu when chasing down the 20th runaway car. And then in terms of collectibles, a lot of the suits in this game are repeats of outfits from the previous 2 titles, and while that makes sense considering the popularity of a few of these, it did make each suit unlock feel considerably less exciting than I found this activity in the past. And with the added addition of colorways, I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of people who love this feature, but outside of a few distinct cases, I found these to be a little bit on the boring or downright ugly side. In my opinion, a lot of these actually just cross the line into that bargain bin action figure territory. And as a quick little side note, it was actually with these suits that I did discover one of the few glitches that exist in this overall polished experience. And that is by loading a new costume and backing out of it too fast, I transformed Spider-Man into an entity that I can only call the Spidey Cube. It did ultimately crash my game, but luckily with pretty active checkpointing, I didn't lose any real progress, so I'm going to chalk this one up to being more of an entertaining type of bug than any type of nuisance. But again, here I am, seemingly bashing the game. And I understand that throughout this video, I've definitely been fairly harsh on this title. I mean, after all, I did find the plot to be severely underwhelming, and I thought that some of the design overhauls were slightly misguided. But I am afraid that I am not accurately presenting how I truly felt while playing this title. Spider-Man 2 is a bigger and more robust version of a game that I already love. I may not agree with all the changes that they made, and I can point out some little shortcomings, but I came home from work every day excited to play just a little bit more of this title. And some standout moments like the Martin Lee sequence or a truly incredible mission with Black Cat that Insomniac made with some of their Ratchet and Clank tech went far to show that this title was still trying to be one of the best superhero games to date. And I still think that it effectively is. It's just that when your foundation is so solid and then your follow-up completely knocks it out of the park, any misstep is going to feel a little bit more dramatic. And maybe this is a lesson in heightened expectations, as I truly did feel like this series was only going to keep getting better with time. But even in this case, where I do feel like they fumbled the story a little bit and some of the changes didn't really hit for me, I did love playing this game. Swinging around never got boring. The combat system was always fun, and even when there were some goofy things going on in the plot, I was still entertained. But my slightly diminished reception to this game, it might say more about my preferences as to why this game didn't particularly land for me. Even with the Arkham series, I thought that the first game was solid. The second was an improvement, but I missed the more contained environment, and somehow Origins, which was a more character-focused and stripped-down version of what had come before it, just edgier and from a different team, that title ended up being my absolute favorite in the series. And maybe that's what's going on for me here. Maybe the spectacle of this title kind of just missed me. And maybe I want slightly more variety after 2 outings in this series. And I personally do prefer a smaller and tighter narrative. But as long as the follow-up to Spider-Man 2 doesn't go all Arkham Knight and add the Spider-Mobile for any real reason, this will always be a series that I am rooting for. And I cannot wait to see what they do in the next entry, whether it be DLC or standalone title. I'm a huge fan of this series, and this didn't change it. It just might have lowered my expectations a bit. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching. It is always greatly appreciated. And if you enjoyed the video, please consider dropping a like, comment, or subscribe. And if you disagree with me, if you think Spider-Man 2 is the best in the series, please let me know. I'd love to know how you ended up at that conclusion. But that's going to be the end of this video. And I hope to see you in the next one. But until then, I hope that you have a beautiful day, and you're all beautiful people.